So this giant thing is a 20 by 24 inch view camera that I built about a year ago. It's almost done. I've just kind of been dragging my feet on the last few finishing touches, but it's pretty much in functioning order. And I've gotten a lot of questions about this, so I figured it would be a good time to do a short little video just kind of recapping the experience of building the camera and kind of why I did it. Some years back, I was living in Phoenix and I found a 20 by 24 inch process camera in the back of an antique shop. I ended up buying the camera. I stripped about 250 pounds worth of steel parts off of it and broke it down into essentially a functioning view camera. I had that for a while. I let some friends borrow it, who then took it on a cross-country road trip, photographing all across the US. And then eventually that camera found its way to Miami, where it was purchased by a wet plate photographer who was going to use it for doing portrait work. So there went my 20 by 24 camera, and a number of years passed and I didn't have one. I'm just kind of obsessed with cameras, particularly big cameras, and so I was wanting another 20 by 24. And instead of buying one, because cameras this large can be incredibly expensive and there's really only a few manufacturers who even make them, I decided that I've made a lot of cameras over the years, so 20 by 24 was something that I should be able to do. And the camera came out great. I wanted it to be lightweight as possible for a 20 by 24 camera, but I wanted it to be lightweight. I wanted it to be fairly compact and be able to break down pretty nicely in case I actually do lose my mind and want to take it out. The camera itself is made almost entirely out of red oak. I think I used a birch plywood base and then built that up from there, but the rest of the body of the camera is made of red oak that I stained. I believe the stain is Kona, which is usually fairly dark, but I applied the stain lightly and did a quick wipe on it so that it had kind of more of a mahogany tone to it. The camera takes 6 by 6 inch round corner Deardorff lens boards, and set up on it right now is a Carl Zeiss 600 millimeter. It's marked 60 centimeters, 600 millimeter f9 Tesser. This is an incredible process lens that more than covers 20 by 24. Initially, I built a roughly 16 by 16 inch camera obscura that I was using this lens on. And I wasn't really using the camera obscura, and I wanted to reclaim some parts from it. So that ended up getting cut down in order to donate parts toward the making of this camera. So the only part of the camera that I didn't have to build from scratch, aside from the accessories like the lens and stuff like that, is the actual spring back on the camera. Because the guy who bought that camera was using it for wet plate, he decided that he was going to build his own wet plate back for it, and so he didn't need the spring back. So I had held on to that for years, waiting for the day that I would build another one of these cameras. So the spring back was actually built by Richard Ritter out of New Hampshire. Richard has built a lot of stuff for me over the years. So he built that spring back, and I had a 20 by 24 film holder, double-sided film holder, that is made by Sandy King. It was made by S&S Holders when they were still around. So I had those already ready. So I spoke with Richard and Sandy to figure out if they had any more film holders. I can't remember who I ended up getting them from, but I ended up securing 2 more 20 by 24 double-sided film holders. So if I did take this out somewhere, if I had it set up in the studio, I'm able to roll with up to 6 exposures at any given point in time, which is pretty amazing for a camera this large. If you're shooting more than 6 exposures with a 20 by 24, you're insane. Anyway, so I had the spring back, I had the holders, those are ready. So I basically built the camera around that spring back and around the focal length of the lens that I knew I wanted to use. Originally when I built the camera, it had a different front standard on it, and it actually had a middle standard. And I had 2 sets of bellows. It had a front bellows. That was one of the parts that was reclaimed off of the camera obscura that donated parts to this, but it had a front set of bellows, which was essentially like an 11 by 14 situation happening there. And then it had a middle standard. It was kind of a floating type situation, a floating middle standard, so that as the camera extended, that middle standard would support the center of the bellows and prevent excessive sag. What I ended up finding though, once I started to test the camera, was that the floating standard kind of created this extra cumbersome part that you had to kind of manage as the camera was focused. And I didn't really like that. And I also realized after looking at my lenses and thinking about what I wanted to shoot and how I wanted to use the camera, I realized that I really wasn't going to be using particularly long focal lengths on this format. And so I realized that I could actually eliminate that whole front bellows section and effectively reduce the maximum focus of the camera, but because I'm not using particularly long lenses, that ended up not being really an issue. So I removed that whole front standard and re-engineered kind of the design of the front of the camera, and it came out exactly the way that I wanted. I actually did like kind of the aesthetic, the design of the original front standard. It was a little bit smaller. It kind of accentuated the angles of the camera and everything like that a little bit more. I liked the way that it looked, but functionally it wasn't ideal. The new front standard is much better. It's much larger, and the front plate that the lens board and assembly is actually attached to comes off. It's one of the things that I haven't quite finished yet, which is why it's kind of gaffered taped into place. But eventually this will be set on some hinges and will work as a door that can actually just open and close. It'll be felt backed on the back to prevent any light leaks. But that's important because at some point I'm going to install this large Packard shutter on the inside of the face of the camera, which will give me the ability to kind of work without having to deal with working with a lens cap type situation. I don't shoot film in this, and I have no intention of shooting film in this. I like slow processes, so my intention with this camera more than anything was to use it with paper negatives, not necessarily film. The cost of 20 by 24 film, even black and white, is insane, and if you're thinking about color film, that's just out of this world. So anyway, I'm just saying that because the lens, the barrel lens, it's not in a shutter, and I don't have a need for a shutter. For those types of slow processes, you're really just working with a lens cap type situation or stopping down if you're in particularly bright light. So I'll be able to do that, and that Packard shutter will give me the ability to kind of have more of a hands-free type operation of the camera. And Packard shutters are nice because they do technically give you a shutter speed, instantaneous, whatever that means. You kind of have to time it for the particular Packard shutter that you have. The larger the shutters, the slower that instantaneous speed is. But it at least gives the option for that, but I'm interested in it more for just an open and close type functionality. So that'll be installed on the opposite side of what you see here on the inside of the camera. And the hole in that Packard shutter is huge, so it'll accommodate this and most other lenses that I might attach to the camera. So the main things that I had to think about when building the camera were overall structural integrity. What kind of wood do I want to use? Is it going to be stable? Is it going to warp over time? And is it going to be strong and capable of supporting kind of the awkwardness of a camera like this? That's why I chose red oak. It's probably my favorite wood to work with in terms of building cameras or parts for cameras. It's very stable. It's a fairly hard wood, but it resists splitting in a lot of ways that some other woods don't. And it takes stain really beautifully. And I'm really happy with how this came out. The bellows, so I've made a lot of bellows over the years, and there are a few things that I hate more than making bellows. So with this camera, I decided that I was going to outsource that. So a bellows manufacturer that I use quite frequently out of China made these bellows for me to my specifications. That was one of the things that I had to think about. You know, when you're making bellows, you need to think about your bellows frames. What's the size of the rear frame? What's the size of the front frame? What's the extension of the bellows? What's the taper of the bellows? Are you going to use bellows that have a portion of the bellows that are straight and then taper, or are they entirely tapered? All of those types of things. So I thought about all of that. I put together some diagrams and I sent them off to my bellows maker, and they were able to send me these, and they're absolutely perfect. So a big part of any view camera is how does it focus? And that was one of the major considerations that I had to really deeply think about. I didn't know if I wanted to go the way of building a geared focus on a camera like this. The old 20 by 24 did have a geared focus, which was pretty nice, but it added a lot of weight. What I ended up deciding on was a set of essentially sliding table tracks. These tracks are designed, I think, for installing in the back of like a pickup truck if you want to have like a table that slides out of it, or they're used for kind of hidden tables inside of cabinets if you live in like New York City or you live in a small space and you're trying to be space efficient. So the track can be used for that as well. So I ended up picking that up. And it ended up working perfectly. I think I get about a maximum of around somewhere between 65 to 70 inches of total extension on this camera, which again, for the focal lengths that I'm using and everything like that, that's more than enough. The track ended up working perfectly. It's bolted down onto the base. The front standard is then attached to that. The camera itself focuses via a rod that's attached. You can see the cap that holds it attached to the front standard here, but there's a rod that goes all the way back through the base of the rear standard, and when standing behind the camera can be focused, and that'll move the front standard in and out. So it is a front focusing camera, kind of more like a technical camera, your Linhofs or your Horseman VHR, those types of cameras. So it focuses in that same sense. The rear standard is fixed. The front standard has front tilt, which works quite well. It also has front swing. So if I ever need to use movements or anything like that, it's fully capable of doing that. Yeah, so that's the camera. So far it's been a lot of fun putting it together. I've yet to take it out, but I'm fully confident that it'll do everything that it needs to do. There's a little bit of fine finishing that still needs to happen. I need to install some felt light traps on the inside, kind of where the front standard and the bellows frame meet up. There'll need to be some felt traps on the inside of the front face of the camera once I actually complete that door assembly, just to make sure there's no light leaks there. And the Packard shutter will need to be installed. But yeah, that's the camera. Hope it's interesting. If you're going to build something like this, or you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below or shoot me an email through the website. But yeah, that's my 20 by 24 camera.